Thanks everyone for coming out to listen to my PAR project, which focused on integrating nanoscience into the college classroom. Next slide, please. My motivation for looking at this particular aspect of teaching or education comes from the fact that there's an emergence of products on the consumer market that are being advertised as nanotechnology based, which has scientists and engineers calling for more formal and informal nanoscience education. The current discussion right now is on the timing and the method of this integration. For example, some educators are split on whether or not this should be a standalone course versus a module within the context of an existing course like physics or chemistry, for example, as well as the timing. Some people believe that this should be reserved for a graduate school versus at the undergraduate level. So with that in mind, I went into developing my research questions for this project. My overarching question was looking at how prepared college freshmen or high school seniors are for tackling or addressing some of these basic nano concepts. Specifically, I wanted to test the use of outreach activities and experiential learning strategies throughout a first-year seminar to gauge its effectiveness at introducing students to these basic concepts. Specifically, I wanted to gauge, are they able to differentiate between the properties of nanomaterials versus conventional materials, and then are they able to identify uses in their everyday lives? Next slide, please. This started out as a kind of a fun outreach activity that my advisor and I then used to develop into this first-year seminar. So most of the results you'll see today, I'll focus on the pre and post course evaluation. The survey that we had students complete were a mixture of prompts that utilized the Likert scale, yes, no, unsure prompts, as well as some open-ended questions. Next slide, please. For a quick snapshot of what this course looks like, we met once a week for 50 minutes. The classes were capped at 19 students, and the student population was mainly first-year students, first-semester students, mostly freshmen with a couple of transfer students sprinkled in. And I included, just for visual sakes, examples of the different modules and activities that we completed as the semester progressed. We started with very simple activities here. I have some snap cubes where we kind of counted how many sides were touching these taste buds to demonstrate surface area to volume ratio. And then we scaled it up to the point where students were coming into lab to synthesize their own nanoparticles, changing their properties. And then we looked at it under electron microscopy. And we finished the course with looking at and playing with current uses of nanomaterials in their everyday lives. Next slide, please. So now we're jumping into some of the results that I'll be showing you today. So this figure here, the y-axis is frequency, and the x is are the responses that the students had to the prompt. Are properties of nanomaterials different than conventional materials? So the blue bar here represents what they thought on the first day of the class before we discussed anything, and then the orange is at the end of the semester. And I'd like to mention that this is an informal survey. So from that question, we could kind of see there were a lot less unsure students by the end of this course, which I think was a good thing. And we also had them explain their rationale. So on the right side of the slide are some examples of the words that came out when we did our word cloud analysis. In the pre-course survey, there was a lot of smaller, I don't know, or they just didn't reply, whereas in the post, we saw smaller getting much smaller, and other terms and phrases coming out, such as reactivity, surface area to volume ratio, optics, or color. Next slide, please. If you recall from earlier, my second objective was to identify their ability to identify nano in their everyday lives. So this is the prompt that they were given. In the pre-course analysis, you can see by the blue bars, it was a very mixed response. A lot of students were unsure if they are able to identify these household items that contain nano. But in the post, I think there was only 2 or so students that were still unsure, but the majority answered yes to this prompt. If we look at the bottom right, underneath confidence rating, we also had students rate themselves from 1 to 5 in terms of their confidence in their ability to identify uses or potential uses of nano in their everyday lives. And you can see that there was a pretty significant shift from very low confidence to about intermediate levels of confidence. And that also was reflected in the examples that we asked students to provide. In the pre-course, we saw a lot of traditional technology-based answers, cell phones, computers, televisions, whereas in the post, we saw a wider range of replies, such as sunscreen, foods, clothes, and waterproofing. Next slide, please. So what are the implications? What can I take away from this kind of short TAR project? When asked if the students thought that this was a good introduction to nanosciences, all but I think one or two students said that they would agree with that statement, that this was a good introduction to the course, which from that I took away that I think my approach to teaching this course, incorporating a lot of hands-on activities, experiential learning, helping them really visualize what nano is and how it can be incorporated into their everyday lives, worked. Next slide, please. And then when asked to rate the technical content of this course to help me evaluate whether or not this freshman population is a good group to introduce nanosciences in, students gave me a very nice normal distribution, which I think is encouraging and which to me suggests that the first semester college student is able to tackle these more complex or challenging or new concepts as long as you kind of put in mind or keep in mind where they're coming from in terms of their background experiences in high school. Next slide, please. And then I'd like to quickly just thank everyone that helped me with this project, my advisor, Boris Lau, my undergraduate helper, Lee Hamlet, Sarah Posiak, and Beth Jacob for their encouragement during this. The NICE network, which is this big network that helps with outreach and informal education for inspiration as well as example activities for me to use in my class. And then, of course, my students for putting up with me through the 2 years that I was doing this. That's it.
Okay, questions. So if you've got questions for Michael, either raise your hand or use the whiteboard tool and write a question. And I guess while people are doing that, so Michael, what's the next step for you?
So unfortunately, my time teaching this course is now over. I would like to incorporate this into my next position if they would let me, which doesn't sound like it's going to happen. But if I had to reteach this over again, I would include a little bit more outside of class reading. That was the main complaint from the students that said that this was too easy or this was not a good introduction, was they wanted to be challenged a lot more.
Other people with questions? Don.
Hi, Michael. Nice presentation. Really appreciated seeing that. Can you tell me what type of courses would follow this in a curriculum where you feel the students would have now a solid foundation for what comes next?
Yeah, I think that's a great question and one that I have with my advisor about what the next step is kind of scaling up. I think these kind of first-year seminars are a great way to really pique the interest of students who maybe have never really learned about nano beforehand. And I think it would have to then jump up to the junior or senior level where you could really dive into these ideas. I'm not sure if there's an intermediate kind of intro to nanoscience 101 that I know of that could fill that gap.
Great. So there are a series of questions on the whiteboard now. We've probably got time for one more. So let me go to if you could do it again, what would you change?
I think I touched on it a little bit before, but I think I would try to make it a lot more technically sound, just to really help some of these students who know they want to go into, let's say, pre-med and jump into how nanomaterials, nanoparticles are being used in medicine instead of kind of a quick overview of the course.